Daemon Targaryen has a cool Valyrian steel sword called Dark Sister, which has been passed down through the Targaryen family all the way from Visenya Targaryen, the dark sister of Aegon the Conqueror. If you've seen House of the Dragon, you've gotten to see this sword in action, but if you watched Game of Thrones, you didn't get to see it. But it seems pretty likely that in the future of the books, we're going to get to see this sword again, which means we were robbed of getting to see one of the characters wield it in seasons 6, 7, or 8 of Game of Thrones. So let's try to figure out where exactly this sword is going to pop back up in the books, and therefore figure out just who we were robbed of getting to see wield this cool Valyrian steel sword in the late seasons of Game of Thrones. So the sword, as I said, is passed down through the Targaryen family line, and it eventually ends up with Brynden Rivers, aka Bloodraven, aka that dude stuck up in the Weirwood Roots who teaches Bran about magic. He took the sword with him to the Wall, where he eventually became Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and then eventually he disappeared north of the Wall, and we have no reason to suspect that the sword wasn't with him. It's no longer at the Night's Watch, it was with him the entire time. We have really good reason basically to suspect that the sword went with him when he disappeared and ended up in the cave, and no real reason to suspect that it ended up anywhere else. So the safe bet is that the sword is somewhere in the cave with Bloodraven. This really narrows down our potential wielders of Dark Sister who could show up in the future of the books. And basically, I don't think Bran is going to be doing anything with the sword, considering he can't really fight with a sword, he wouldn't be very useful with it, so I think we can rule him out. Bloodraven is, for the same reason, sort of strapped up to a tree, even more immobile than Bran, so it's not going to be him. I don't think it's likely to be one of the Children of the Forest, and Jojen may or may not be paced. We'll put Jojen on the list of plausible users of the sword, but he doesn't seem like he'd be the greatest with it. I also feel fairly comfortable assuming that Summer isn't gonna grab the sword in his mouth and run through a bunch of others, slicing them open and shattering them or anything like that. As cool as that would be, I don't think that's very likely. So, as you can see, our list of characters is growing fairly small for people who are in the cave and capable of wielding a sword. Before I get to the main few candidates, I would like to introduce a potential dark horse candidate. I've talked in the past about how it seems very likely that Benjen Stark ended up with the Children of the Forest at least at some point. They find a somewhat new Night's Watch cloak buried at the Fist of the First Men with Children of the Forest weapons in it, and Benjen hasn't been seen in quite a while. When that's first announced at Winterfell, Bran thinks, oh, the Children of the Forest will help him. Which could definitely be a little hint that maybe that is exactly what happened, because Bran is completely dismissed in book 1 when he says that, but by book 5 we know that that's a real possibility, so maybe it is genuinely the answer. It would definitely sort of fit that this easily dismissed comment in book 1 actually turns out to be true later on in book 6 or so. So yeah, if Benjen Stark ended up with the Children of the Forest and then they sent him out of the cave on some sort of mission where he has to be safe from the others or potentially even fight off some others, arming him with a Valyrian steel sword that can likely kill the others, well, that would make some sense, so perhaps if we find Uncle Benjen, he will be wielding Dark Sister. What potential mission they could have sent him out on at this point would just be pure speculation and speculation for another video, but I did just want to bring up the idea that maybe the reason that the sword is not in the cave or hasn't been seen in the cave so far, let's remember we only have had one chapter in the cave, so there's plenty of stuff that could still be in there that we haven't seen yet, but maybe the reason that we haven't seen the sword is because it's somewhere else with Uncle Benjen. So he's definitely on the short list for people who could have the sword, but assuming that he doesn't have it and assuming that it's still in the cave, let's talk about the other couple candidates for who could potentially be wielding it. First of all, let's start with Meera. She is the sister of Jojen, and if Jojen has been turned into paste, well, that's probably going to make her quite angry and may indeed make her into a Dark Sister who could find and wield Dark Sister in the Winds of Winter. Also, assuming that there is a return journey home where she needs to protect Bran, having a Valyrian steel sword would definitely be a useful thing to have along, and she's decent in combat with at least a frog spear and a net, so adding a Valyrian steel sword to that arsenal, I don't know, that seems like it would make some sense, even if she's not like the best trained with a sword. If you can just, shatter another with a Valyrian steel sword by making good contact with it, I think that Mira could at least swing a sword around well enough to find some use from Dark Sister. If the sword is taken south by Meera, I think there's a decent chance that it may eventually end up in the hands of Arya, who is the dark sister of the Stark family, and who I think maybe originally was meant to have Dark Sister. I've talked in previous videos about how in the original outline of the series, Arya was going to end up north of the Wall with Bran, and I think would have probably ended up playing a similar role to what Meera Reed is doing now, where she ends up in the cave with Bran and is somewhat his protector as he can't really move all that well and has lots of magic to learn. So if she ended up taking Dark Sister from the cave, well, that would just fit perfectly. So if that was George's original plan for Dark Sister to end up with Arya, well then maybe he'll garden his way back to that original plan and have Meera at some point give it to Arya. That would make some sense to me as well. I do definitely wonder, though, if the way that the story has shaken out, Arya's going to be old enough to actually wield this full on sword. She's decent with Needle, but she's also still much younger than I think George originally intended her to be, and she's sort of small, just in general, so her wielding a full on Valyrian steel sword may not actually work super well. I don't necessarily know. Maybe George will just overlook that and make it happen anyway, but I could see her just sticking with Needle till the end of the series. A bit of evidence, though, that the sword may end up with Arya or potentially be used by Meera is that it is described as a slender blade that seems to be designed for a woman's hand, so it does have some foreshadowing that potentially it would end up with one of them. And again, if you just assume that Arya will be at least old enough to wield a full on sword, this is a pretty good candidate for which sword she could wield. Overall, though, I would say Arya and Meera are basically tied in second place for who I think would end up wielding the sword. It would be Meera first, and then potentially ending up with Arya, or potentially just staying with Meera. But there is someone who is number one on this list who I think is definitely big enough to get some good use out of this sword. That is, of course, none other than Hodor, and actually, I think this is probably the most likely because we have a very solid place in which Hodor could be wielding this sword that it would be really useful. The hold the door moment. George has confirmed that the hold the door moment will be playing out in the books as well, but it'll be playing out differently. That is what Hodor means, but in the books it's going to end up being more like holding a doorway or holding a pass, and he's talked about how Bran is warging into Hodor and practicing with swordplay, so it seems like the thing that's eventually going to mess up Hodor's mind is when Bran has to warg into him and defend a doorway or a pass from the others. A big guy standing in a narrow pass with a sword fighting off these undead that are coming at him. And if he has a Valyrian steel sword which can take them out more easily and actually kill them, well, that just makes entirely too much sense. This really feels like the perfect way for Dark Sister to re enter the series and serve a very useful purpose. We don't know for sure if Hodor's going to use Dark Sister for this moment, but I think it would be more useful than the sword he took from the crypts, which could be used as more of a practice sword, and then when the time actually comes, maybe he takes the Valyrian steel sword. The full George quote, which comes from Fire Cannot Kill a Dragon, as he's talking about the hold the door moment, he says, I thought they executed it very well, but there are going to be differences in the book. They did it very physical, hold the door with Hodor's strength. In the book, Hodor has stolen one of the old swords from the crypt. Bran has been warging into Hodor and practicing with his body, because Bran has been trained in swordplay. So telling Hodor, hold the door, is more like, hold this pass, defend it when enemies are coming, and Hodor is fighting and killing them. A little different, but the same idea. So that could definitely mean that he is just going to use that sword from the crypt, but a very old sword like that, I don't necessarily know how useful that's going to be, as I said, in comparison to a Valyrian steel sword, which may be able to pretty much one-shot every enemy that Hodor comes up against. Either way, this is going to be paying off a ton of foreshadowing from early on in the series, obviously the name Hodor, but in addition to that, Bran suggests early on, once he's crippled, he wants to still be a knight. He suggests that him and Hodor could combine to be a knight. He could ride on top of Hodor and swing the sword, and Hodor could be his legs. But Maester Luwin says that that can't happen because a man, when he fights, his mind and his body need to be as one, and all his actions need to line up and all of that, which is true, but Bran is going to use magic to essentially find a way around that. So he and Hodor can actually combine to fight, at least for this one moment. And just imagine how crazy of a moment it'll be when Hodor has Bran warged into him and he's defending this pass, holding the door with his sword, chopping down wights or others as they come at him one by one because it's such a narrow little pass. And basically, he seems unstoppable. But then one of the things that'll happen eventually is Bran is going to have to jump back out of Hodor. And I think that the reason this will probably end up happening is once Bran gets on the outside of the cave, he's not going to be able to warg into the cave and warg into Hodor. We saw this exact thing happen when they went into the cave. Bran was warged into Hodor, fighting off wights because they were under attack when they went in, and as soon as Hodor crossed into the barrier, Bran was ejected out of Hodor by the magic of the two weirwoods that are on either side of the entrance, and once Hodor crossed over that threshold, Bran was kicked out. So once Bran crosses over the threshold on the way out, it makes a lot of sense to me that he's going to have to leave Hodor there to actually hold the door himself. And so it would seem that, much like in the television show, this thing is going to be what messes up Hodor's mind, him being told to hold the door further once Bran and Meera actually leave. Now, it is entirely possible, I suppose, that Bran could stay warged into Hodor for longer once they leave the cave, because if the spells that are broken that allow the Whites and the others to potentially get into the cave are the same spells that kicked Bran out of Hodor when they crossed through the, magic threshold of the entrance, well, maybe those spells are completely broken, and so Bran could stay warged into Hodor for longer, if the whole spell of, the magic tree town or, that whole hill that they're on is completely broken. I don't really know. But at some point or another, it would seem that Bran is going to get far enough away where he's going to have to get out of Hodor, and it would seem that Hodor's actually going to have to hold the door. We know that Bran's going to be in his mind for a lot of this fight, but it also seems to be the case that him being told hold the door is the thing that has broken his mind and made it so that he can only say Hodor. So it would seem that at some point Bran's going to have to get out of his mind and tell the actual Hodor hold the door. Whatever magical shenanigans take place that require Hodor to eventually hold the door, this does seem to be the way that he's eventually going to go out. So him going out with a Valyrian steel sword means that he's going to be able to hold the door much longer and he's going to be much more effective in this situation. And I do think this is probably what Dark Sister is destined for. Again, no guarantees because there are many interesting ways that this could go, but let me know what you guys think of any of that down in the comments. I personally wouldn't be mad about any of the options that I've brought up so far in this video being the one to actually wield Dark Sister, but I do sort of think that Hodor holding the door with it is probably my favorite as of right now. Who do you think is likely to wield Dark Sister in the Winds of Winter? Is it going to be Hodor? Is it going to be Meera and then eventually potentially Arya, maybe Uncle Benjen? Or do you think that maybe there's some other use that I haven't even thought of for this video that Dark Sister could be used for? Popping up in the end cards on your screen right now should be links to a couple other videos from my channel that YouTube thinks you'll enjoy, as well as a link to the playlist of the silly country music songs that I've recently written and released. If you want to find yourself transported back to the time of the gold rush and cowboy shenanigans, well, feel free to check that out. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back with something else very soon.